20 years ago, in the peaceful coastal city of Naples, a man stepped out of his house one evening and vanished without a trace, leaving his family plunged into panic and despair. Authorities quickly launched an investigation, but they only found his body at Clam Pass Park under strange circumstances, with far too few clues to determine what really happened. Lingering suspicions about a close acquaintance persisted, but without evidence, no witnesses, and no statements strong enough to proceed, the case ground to a complete halt. For 2 decades, that pain never faded, and many of the victims' loved ones clung to the hope that one day the truth would come to light, even if it was just a slim chance. Then, unexpectedly, when the cold case unit reopened the old file, a piece of evidence that seemed useless, a heavily distorted cassette tape, revealed a detail that everyone had overlooked for 20 years, a detail powerful enough to upend the entire investigation, forcing everyone involved to confront a truth darker than anyone had ever imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chilling cold case. Summer evenings in Naples, Florida, always carried a light humidity from the brackish waters and the vast mangroves stretching around the city. The neighborhood where the Holt family lived was not far from the Gordon River, a quiet area with palm-lined streets and warm yellow light spilling from the riverside home. It was what seemed like an ordinary evening when neighbors saw Richard Holt step out of his house, close the door behind him, and walk toward his car parked in the driveway. He wasn't carrying a bag or anything noteworthy, just everyday clothes, with no sign he was preparing for a long trip. Richard had a habit of going out at the end of the day to get some cooler air, sometimes driving near the river to relax before heading home. Everything about that final sighting was calm, with no hint of anything unusual. Inside the house, the living room light was still on, and his wife Mary Ann Holt assumed he was just stepping out for a bit and would return as usual. Their twin daughters were still awake, going about their routine, with no signs that made the family worry. As time passed, the familiar sounds of the neighborhood gradually quieted as night fully settled. In the Holt home, the atmosphere remained still. There was no sound of a car pulling into the driveway, no door opening, no footsteps of Richard coming back. For those who had lived with him for years, such a prolonged absence wasn't normal. By the time the whole family had gone to sleep and he still hadn't returned, the thick silence of the night began to create an indescribable feeling. Richard was cautious and had a habit of staying in touch. Disappearing without warning wasn't in his character. Still, the family tried to stay calm, thinking he might be at a familiar spot and would come back later than usual. The next morning, Florida sunlight streamed through the windows, but Richard's car was still missing from the driveway, and his phone gave no response at all. The family checked around the house, called places he frequented, and reached out to a few acquaintances, but everyone said they hadn't seen him. At this point, the sense of something wrong became clear. Everyone knew that the time he'd been gone had far exceeded his daily routine. After searching without results, the Holt family decided to call the police to report a missing person. That call marked the beginning of an event no one in the Naples neighborhood could have foreseen. Right after the missing person report was made by the Holt family that morning, the duty officer at the Collier County Sheriff's Office began recording every detail according to missing person procedures. The information was entered into the system: the missing person's name, age, physical description, health status, last seen time, along with confirmation from the reporter that Richard Holt had left home the previous evening and hadn't returned. Upon hearing that he was someone with stable communication habits, no history of staying out overnight, and no record of wandering off, the duty officer flagged the case as priority, classifying it as missing under unclear circumstances, the category requiring a rapid response. As soon as the initial report was completed, he immediately forwarded the order to the nearest patrol unit in the Naples Park area, instructing them to go to the Holt home for an on-site check. The order emphasized that the missing person was an older man who disappeared after leaving home alone, carrying no special items. The patrol unit received the details, confirmed the direction, and quickly left the station. When the patrol car pulled up in front of the Holt family home, the tense atmosphere from early morning was still evident. The two officers approached the front door, introduced themselves and the reason for their visit. Mary Ann Holt let them in and led them to the living room where the twin daughters were waiting. There, the police confirmed the information already reported to dispatch. Richard had left home the previous evening, without saying where he was going, and the family had no further contact from that point until reporting him missing. The officers asked concise questions, focused on factors to help determine search directions. Did Richard usually drive or walk? Did he have habits of going to certain areas? What did he take when leaving the house? Marianne and the daughters said Richard often drove near the Gordon River as a way to relax at the end of the day. He didn't take any special belongings, just wearing everyday clothes. There were no notes or plans left in the house. After gathering the basic information, the two officers conducted a general inspection of the home. Doors and windows showed no signs of forced entry. Items in the living room and kitchen were undisturbed. The garage was empty of his car, confirming Richard had driven it away. The traces at the home didn't suggest conflict or leaving in panic. An adult voluntarily leaving home in the evening isn't unusual, but the loss of contact overnight made the police more cautious. Immediately afterward, the patrol began a quick sweep of the nearby area, briefly contacting immediate neighbors to confirm the last time Richard was seen. Some said they saw him leave the house the previous evening, but no one saw him return. No one reported unusual sounds or activity in the area late at night. Based on family statements and neighbor data, police identified the priority search area around the Gordon River section Richard frequented. The officers spread a map on the patrol car's hood, marking spots he often stopped. A few small turnoffs to the water's edge, parking areas near mangroves, and sections overlooking the river. These locations became the first points the search teams needed to reach in the coming hour. Noting that the disappearance had lasted overnight with no signal from Richard, police decided to launch an official search. Road patrol units were deployed to routes around the neighborhood and riverside parking lots. Another team prepared to deploy boats to scan nearshore water. An internal alert was sent to prepare for expanding the search if priority locations yielded nothing. As the units prepared to leave the Holt home to begin search operations, the family was informed of the initial investigation scope and the process for the day. At this stage, police had no signs indicating an unusual case, but they didn't rule out the possibility it could be more serious than expected. Every next step had to be taken quickly and accurately, as the first hours are always critical in locating a missing person. The official investigation began from there, focusing on determining Richard Holt's final journey and why he vanished without a trace on a quiet summer night in Naples. From the initial information gathered at the Holt home, patrol forces quickly shifted to deploying a field search, starting from points along the Gordon River where Richard often went. That same morning, as the first team reached the riverbank area, a detailed map was unfolded to clearly identify priority zones, including trails leading to the water, open spots along the river where locals often stopped, and mangrove sections connecting informal walking paths. The ground search team split into smaller groups, each responsible for surveying a portion of the terrain. They entered trails running parallel to the river, checking large bushes, areas used by locals for fishing or rest. Officers looked for footprints, tire tracks, or any ground changes indicating Richard's recent presence. The soil in this area was damp and good for prints, but also easily erased by tides and typical short Florida rains, making the search hard. Almost simultaneously with the ground teams, the Water Patrol deployed small boats along the Gordon River. They scanned close to the water's edge for floating objects, items caught in mangrove roots, or any signs related to Richard or his vehicle. A drone team was mobilized for overhead observation. Drone cameras allowed much faster coverage, especially in dense mangrove sections hard for ground teams to reach. Drone footage was transmitted live to the coordination point for immediate analysis. In deeper water spots, diver teams were brought in. They systematically searched selected areas, based on the possibility Richard slipped or had an accident. Though police had no clear reason yet to suspect accident or crime, underwater scanning was mandatory in missing person protocols for areas with river and canal terrain like Naples. During the search, patrols collected scattered items: a metal bottle cap, a length of paracord, a few fabric scraps of unknown origin drifting near the water's edge. All were bagged and tagged for lab checks, but at this stage, none showed direct links to Richard. Determining relevance required time and detailed analysis, as riverside areas saw heavy foot traffic, making unrelated items very likely. Richard's car was not in any parking spot along the search route. This detail particularly caught the field commander's attention. If the car wasn't near the river, the possibility Richard left the area in his vehicle or something happened elsewhere had to be considered. However, without specific data pointing elsewhere, the search continued, expanding along Gordon River tributaries and trails into mangroves. Officers also checked informal paths created by locals over time. These paths often blended into thick bushes, leading to secluded spots hard to spot without approaching closely. The complex riverside terrain made the search time-consuming and required constant coordination between ground, water, and air teams. By late day, as sunlight softened, the interim report sent to headquarters noted only identified items, with no signs of Richard or his car. The lack of direct traces made officers realize this wouldn't be a simple missing person case. Still, they kept the search focused around the river, as Richard's daily habits suggested it remained the most likely starting point for answers. Despite no results yet, the search was expanding. The investigation was just beginning, and the team knew they had to thoroughly scan each area, as any detail, no matter how small, could become a key piece in figuring out what happened to Richard Holt after he left home the previous evening. As the search operation in the Gordon River area continued to expand into the second day without yielding any direct signs, unexpected information from a location a few miles away suddenly shifted the entire search team's atmosphere to a state of high alert. An environmental patrol officer at Clam Pass Park, a popular Naples spot known for its sandy beaches, mangrove forests, and boardwalks, reported discovering an object suspected to be a human body entangled in a cluster of submerged tree roots, not far from the park's main boardwalk. Since the tide was going out at the time, part of the body was more exposed and sufficient for the patrol officer to recognize the abnormality. The information was immediately relayed to the team handling Richard Holt's missing person case. Officers searching the Gordon River area received the signal and redirected immediately. Upon arriving at Clam Pass Park, the environmental patrol team had already preliminarily sealed off the area to prevent public access. The body's location was within the intertwined roots of the mangrove forest, where the water was only ankle-deep due to the low tide level. This was an area that an ordinary person would rarely enter given the wet, muddy, and dense terrain. As they approached, the officers confirmed that it was indeed the body of an elderly man, and the initial identifying features matched the description of Richard Holt. The body was motionless, with clothing intact, but showing no signs of a typical drowning accident. There were no characteristic scrapes from impacts with rocks or sharp objects underwater, and the body's posture did not resemble that of someone swept away by current. The position caught in the roots gave the impression that the body had been brought there from elsewhere or drifted there under unnatural conditions. At that moment, the officers began establishing the primary crime scene, marking a safe radius around the area. Caution tape was set up to prevent civilians and tourists from approaching this section of the mangroves. A scene documentation team was called in to photograph, video record, and collect all initial data: the body's position, water level, surrounding vegetation, clothing condition, and any objects within a several-meter radius. One detail that caught the police's attention was the body lying in shallow water, whereas if the victim had drowned naturally elsewhere, the body would typically float up or drift to open water before getting caught. The location at Clam Pass Park, an area with sections of low-flow water, raised questions about whether this was the actual site of death, or merely where the body ended up afterward. During the scene survey, officers searched for any related items, documents, phone, wallet, watch, or other physical signs. However, none of Richard's personal belongings were found near the body, further reinforcing suspicions that this was only the final point of the journey, not where the incident occurred. After completing scene evidence collection, the medical examiner's team was notified to transport the body. The wrapping process was done carefully to avoid disturbing traces. A quick on-site report was prepared, noting all initial information: discovery date and time, environmental conditions, and reasons why the scene did not fit a natural accident. At this point, police made no conclusions, but the initial observations were enough for them to cautiously shift the case to a more serious direction. The body was placed on a stretcher and transported via the boardwalk at Clam Pass Park, under the investigation team's supervision. Everyone present understood this was the biggest turning point since Richard was reported missing. As the specialized vehicle departed to take the body to the Collier County Medical Examiner's office, all that remained at the scene were the caution tapes and the search team's footprints, evidence of an investigation that had just entered a completely different phase. At the medical examiner's office, specialists prepared the detailed autopsy process to determine cause of death, time of death, and any signs of third-party involvement. Meanwhile, the investigation team had to await results to determine whether they were dealing with an accident or a more serious truth, gradually emerging from the quiet waters of Naples. When Richard Holt's body was transported to the Collier County Medical Examiner's office, the team of specialists quickly began the formal autopsy process. Initial observations from the scene had raised many questions, but only forensic results could determine the cause of death and clarify what really happened during the time he went missing. This initial step was key to redirecting the entire investigation. Preliminary autopsy results soon revealed signs completely inconsistent with an accident. On Richard's body, the forensic team noted a severe wound in the abdominal area, characteristic of a close-range shotgun blast. Tissue analysis showed the bullet hole matched .20-gauge ammunition, a common hunting round, but still lethal at close range. The wound's shape and surrounding tissue damage indicated Richard was shot directly, not in a collision or accidental manner. During blood testing, the forensic team detected significant levels of a benzodiazepine-class sleep aid. This drug is typically prescribed for sleep support, but the dosage in Richard's body was much higher than normal use. This raised a major question. Did Richard take the drug himself before disappearing, or was it administered another way? The presence of the sleep aid meant he was likely unable to react or defend himself at the time of the incident, a key factor suggesting the victim may have been incapacitated before the attack. Alongside the injury and drug evidence, the forensic team confirmed absolutely no signs of drowning. Richard's lungs contained no water consistent with prolonged drifting, and there were no biological responses to water immersion. This proved he died before the body appeared at Clam Pass Park. The combination of the gunshot wound, sleep drug levels, and lack of drowning signs painted a clear picture. Richard died due to human action, not accident. When the autopsy report was sent to investigators, officers immediately expanded their work back to the Holt home. The house, previously only superficially checked during the missing person phase, now became the focal point. A specialized crime scene investigation team was mobilized to conduct a detailed survey. They focused on Richard's private spaces, the bedroom and adjacent hallway, where the incident was highly likely to have occurred. During observation, several signs immediately drew attention. Under the nightstand, investigators found a .20-gauge shotgun shell wedged deep in a wood crevice. The shell appeared overlooked during cleanup, as its position was not easily visible. This directly connected to the forensic conclusion about the fatal ammunition type. Additionally, the wooden floor near the bed showed faint smeared streaks, characteristic of cleaning with a detergent. Under specialized lighting, the streaks extended in a consistent direction, as if a heavy object had been dragged from the bed toward the back door. These drag marks had no explanation in normal household activity that the family could provide, and they aligned with the hypothesis that the body was moved from the death site to elsewhere. Investigators also noted slight differences in color and texture on a section of wall near the bed, where it appeared to have been wiped or scrubbed harder than surrounding areas. All these traces, when combined, formed a clear logical chain. The fatal event occurred in Richard's bedroom, after which the body was dragged away and removed from the house. With this conclusion established, the case was officially shifted from missing person to homicide. The investigation's starting point was no longer where Richard disappeared, but who caused his death, how and why. The shift from search to murder investigation marked a completely new phase, where every detail in the Holt home and every relationship of the victim had to be re-examined from a criminal perspective. And it was here that the case began to reveal more complex layers, far beyond what the initial search team could have imagined. The forensic results and home scene examination had completely changed the investigation's direction, but they also opened up a larger set of challenges that police had to face immediately. With evidence showing Richard Holt was shot dead in his bedroom and then taken to Clam Pass Park, the investigation team expected to quickly identify those involved. However, the search for the perpetrator encountered a series of serious obstacles from the very first day. The first and biggest problem was the absence of direct witnesses. Although the Holt residential area was quiet, it still had many households and passers-by, yet no one reported hearing loud noises, gunshots, arguments, or any unusual signs on the night Richard was believed to have been killed. A close-range shotgun blast would certainly produce significant noise, but at that time no neighbors recorded any similar sounds. This meant police could not rely on witness accounts to accurately reconstruct the timing or circumstances of the crime. The second issue was the lack of security cameras. In 2001, the Naples Park area did not have widespread urban camera systems like today. Residential homes in the area also rarely had surveillance cameras installed. This meant police had no video footage of activity around the Holt home on the night of the incident, and could not track Richard's vehicle movements after leaving the scene. Combining image data sources, a key strategy in modern investigations, was nearly impossible in this case. The third problem stemmed from the nature of the crime. No murder weapon was found. Although a 20-gauge shell was discovered in the bedroom, the shotgun used to kill Richard was completely missing. This created major difficulties in identifying who might own such a weapon, and whether it was stored, moved, or disposed of immediately after the crime. Without the gun, police could not conduct ballistics comparisons or use traces from the weapon to expand the suspect list based on ownership. With no witnesses, no cameras, and no weapon recovered, police were forced to broaden the list of potential suspects. They started with those closest to Richard: family, friends, acquaintances. But no one in this group had a clear motive or direct evidence linking them to the crime. The victim's closest contacts all insisted they heard nothing, saw nothing, or knew nothing unusual before he disappeared. All provided information was general descriptions of Richard's habits and personality, with no suspicious indicators pointing to a specific individual. In the following months, the investigation team continued screening the victim's social relationships, checking financial history, cross-referencing phone calls, and any unusual transactions. But no clear leads pointed to a specific investigative direction. The lack of physical evidence and witnesses created a complete deadlock. Investigation reports from this period noted dozens of hypotheses raised and then discarded, but none could withstand legal evidence requirements. Over time, the case made no further progress. Initial investigators gradually moved to new cases, while Richard Holt's file continued to thicken with notes, but no new evidence. Despite being considered a serious homicide, it lacked the core elements to continue a situation that forced police into a decision they did not want, moving the file to cold case status. This process happened gradually. Initially, the case remained on the active watch list, but as all paths led to dead ends and no new information emerged for years, the file was officially archived in the county's cold case storage, alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases. Some evidence was kept in the property room, while the rest, paper documents and scene photos, was stored in filing cabinets. This information was preserved for potential future reinvestigation, but for a long time afterward, no investigative hands touched it. The Richard Holt case, which had drawn attention at the time of his disappearance, gradually became a faded name on the list of unsolved crimes. No new leads, no confessions, no one coming forward with additional information. That prolonged silence caused the case to fall into a dormant state, awaiting different conditions, a different time, or different technology that might reignite hope for the truth. And for nearly 2 decades, that is exactly what happened. The case sank into complete deadlock, becoming a true cold case, until a new generation of investigators, along with more modern forensic tools, reopened a door that seemed permanently closed. The autopsy results and crime scene evidence were sufficient to determine that Richard Holt's death was a homicide, but at the same time they provided no clear leads for the investigating team at that time. As the initial months passed without any additional clues being gathered, the case file gradually moved down the priority list for the police force, and from that point of deadlock, the Holt case entered a phase that lasted nearly 2 decades, a phase of near total silence. After being classified as an unsolved case, the Holt file was transferred to the archives of the Collier County Sheriff's Office. This was a vast record storage system, with hundreds of cold cases categorized by year. Richard's file fit neatly into a labeled plastic box containing investigation reports, crime scene photos, a sketch of the bedroom, and documents collected from family and neighbors. Additionally, the physical evidence from the case, including the 20-gauge shell casing, samples collected from the bedroom, and items found near Clam Pass Park, was sealed in specialized bags and stored in the area reserved for unsolved homicide evidence. In the early 2000s, trace evidence analysis and evidence tracing methods were far more limited than they would become later. Those samples, though still legally valid, could not be fully exploited with the technology available at the time. There were no advanced tools for audio analysis, no robust national ballistics database, no AI for trace matching, and no detailed crime scene reconstruction technology like today. This left the case, despite its many unanswered questions, lacking the necessary tools for a breakthrough. As the original investigators moved on to other cases, retired, or were reassigned to different units, newer officers had little reason to delve deeply into this file. Subsequent generations of investigators, many of whom hadn't even graduated high school when the crime occurred, knew it only as a rarely mentioned name, just one entry in the long list of the county's cold cases. With no one pushing it forward, no new tips coming in, and no events reigniting public interest, the Holt case slowly faded into oblivion. In the archives, Richard Holt's document box was no different from hundreds of others, neatly organized, carefully stored according to regulations, but untouched. The crime scene photos were still there, though the paper had yellowed with age. Handwritten notes from 2001 interviews had faded. Old audio files remained in plastic bags, never converted to digital format. All this data became dormant evidence, waiting for someone in the future with enough patience and determination to reopen it page by page. For nearly 20 years, there were no calls from the public with new information. No one confessed. No evidence was submitted to the police. The case's timeline remained completely frozen, something rare even among unsolved cases, which sometimes see faint signals emerge after many years. Meanwhile, the Collier County Cold Case Unit underwent numerous changes. The team expanded, equipment improved gradually, but resources remained limited, meaning old cases were only reopened in prioritized waves. Among the multitude of files reviewed over those years, the Holt case never made the list for reinvestigation. Not because it was less important, but because it had no new data to justify revisiting it. At that point, from an outsider's perspective, few would have thought the Richard Holt case still had a chance of being reopened. But inside that cold storage room, all the critical evidence remained preserved intact, waiting for new technology, a fresh perspective, or a new investigator to decide to bring it back into the light. And this seemingly permanent stagnation inadvertently preserved the key pieces for the breakthrough that would come many years later. After nearly 2 decades lying dormant in storage, the Richard Holt case file truly had a chance to come back to life when the Collier County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit began its periodic review of unsolved cases. This review occurred on a cyclical basis, guided by priority criteria: severity of the crime, existence of physical evidence that could be reanalyzed, and cases where modern technology might yield a breakthrough. On the list of dozens of files pulled for consideration that round, the name Richard Holt, 2001 appeared with a brief note. Homicide, no suspect identified. It was at this moment that Detective Aaron Bishop, a newer generation investigator in the unit, was assigned to take on the case. Bishop was known within the unit for his detailed, systematic approach, and especially his patience with cases that seemed unsolvable. To him, cold cases weren't just old files gathering dust in a cabinet, they were unfinished stories, waiting for the right moment to continue. Bishop started by requesting all materials related to the Holt case: initial reports, interview notes, crime scene photos, forensic results, and any supplemental documents created during the He even obtained permission to access the original physical evidence stored in the sealed area, items that had never been analyzed with modern technology. In the first days of review, Bishop read every page in the thick file, noting key points as well as inconsistencies. He paid particular attention to the contrast between the crime's seriousness and the slow initial progress, which indicated that the investigating team back then had lacked the necessary tools to push the case further. While reviewing crime scene photos, Bishop noticed small details that had been overlooked. The exact position of the shell casing in the bedroom, suspected drag marks on the wooden floor, and how the furniture was arranged when police arrived. These details, from a modern perspective, suggested post-crime cleanup, an element common in homicides committed by someone known to the victim. He also re-examined the reports from the Clam Pass Park recovery site. Forensic experts in 2001 had documented the body's position and environmental conditions, but Bishop spotted an inconsistency between the area's normal current flow and where the body was found. With experience from similar cases, he knew bodies rarely drift into dense mangrove root areas without external force or pulling. This suggested the body had been placed or accidentally lodged there after being moved. A key detail never deeply analyzed at the time. Family statements about Richard's habits also made Bishop pause longer. According to initial reports, family members described his late-night outings as routine and harmless. But Bishop flagged that the time Richard left the house had no clear reason, and his disappearance without personal items didn't align with typical behavior for leaving brief. He noted this as a point needing re-verification, since unusual departure behavior often indicates a controlled or lured scenario. One of the things that struck Bishop most was how quickly the case reached a deadlock, almost as if efforts to expand the investigation scope were lacking. Many critical questions from 2001 were never followed up, such as whether Richard had contact with anyone before leaving, who was the last person to see him besides neighbors, or if anyone outside the family could access the Holt home that night. Bishop's initial notes began forming a clearer picture. The case had many potential leads, but in 2001, those leads were beyond the reach of available technology or overlooked due to limited resources. This convinced him that re-examining it with new methods could open an entirely different path. Combining his own experience with access to more advanced forensic technology, Bishop decided to dive deeper into every piece of evidence, and that decision, though unknown at the time, would be the turning point that saved the entire case from nearly 2 decades of darkness. After the initial days reviewing the full file, Detective Aaron Bishop decided to focus on what he believed had been oversimplified in 2001, the timeline of the night Richard Holt disappeared. This was the foundation for determining the victim's movements, time of death, and whether the victim moved voluntarily or was moved. What Bishop aimed to do wasn't just reread the timeline, but analyze it with modern tools and knowledge unavailable to investigators back then. Bishop's first step was cross-referencing old statements from 3 key sources: the Holt family, neighbors, and the initial search team. From the interview records, the last confirmed sighting of Richard leaving the house was fairly clear. However, what remained unclear in 2001 was the gap between when he left home and when the body was discovered. That gap had been treated as natural ambiguity in a missing person case, but Bishop saw it as the area with the most contradiction. He started with environmental data, a resource underutilized in Bishop contacted hydrological agencies and obtained flow data for the Gordon River and waters near Clam Pass around the time of the crime. By reconstructing charts of water levels, current directions, flow speeds, and tidal patterns, he created a comprehensive model of the area's water condition. When placing Richard's body discovery location into that model, Bishop quickly realized what the 2001 report lacked: the resources to analyze deeply. The body could not have drifted naturally to where it was found. Clam Pass Park, with its dense mangrove roots, wasn't a place a body would naturally wash into, especially from the Gordon River area where the initial search focused. Currents over the 3 days around the incident were recorded as low, with north to south flow too weak to carry a human body that far in a short time. Additionally, water movement directions and eddies didn't match a natural drift ending precisely in a root cluster as initially discovered. Bishop cross-referenced crime scene photos from Clam Pass Park. The roots where the body was entangled were in an area with shallow water only at low tide. This was a nearly still zone, without strong pushing force, and especially unlikely for a body to gain enough momentum to lodge exactly there. This left 2 possibilities: the body was placed there, or it drifted a very short distance from a nearby similar spot. But the nearest such spot was too close to the park's walking areas, a place where, if Richard went voluntarily, someone would surely have seen him at night, which didn't match any witness statements. From there, Bishop shifted to comparing data from the Holt home. The forensic time of death aligned with when Richard was believed to still be in the house the previous night. There was no evidence he left the bedroom area after that. Combined with the gunshot wound and sedatives in the victim's system, Bishop determined there was no possibility Richard walked or drove himself to Clam Pass Park. He further analyzed maps of distances between the Holt home and Clam Pass Park, marking major and minor. The distance raised suspicions. If Richard went to Clam Pass voluntarily, he would have traveled a considerable way, surely leaving traces, traffic cameras, witnesses at parking lots, or pedestrians. But the entire 2001 file had no such record. Additionally, Bishop examined the victim's clothing condition in forensic photos. No major tears, no mud from repeated scraping, no long skid marks, and clothing not displaced as if moving through muddy terrain, all consistent with the body being moved while immobile, rather than self-movement or water drift. Another key piece came from the drag marks in Richard's bedroom. When incorporating this into the full timeline, Bishop saw everything aligned step by step: time of death, cleanup signs, drag mark, and body location, all supporting one conclusion. Richard was killed in the bedroom, the body dragged out of the house, placed in a vehicle, and finally taken to Clam Pass Park. This conclusion not only demolished the initial accident hypothesis, but clearly established the crime's nature: a deliberate act by one or more individuals with access to the home that night. With the successful timeline reconstruction, Bishop had the first piece in a new case picture, and from here, the investigation began expanding in entirely different directions than in. The line of reasoning about the body being transported drew Detective Aaron Bishop's particular attention to the possibility that evidence had been overlooked or not properly analyzed in the initial phase. The mismatch between the crime scene and the location where the body was found indicated that the case involved staging, and in cases like this, physical evidence inside the victim's home often played a more crucial role than any traces in the field. From that assessment, Bishop expanded the scope of his review to the evidence storage facility, where boxes of case files had been sitting untouched for 2 decades. The Collier County Evidence Vault still maintained the same organization from the early. Plastic boxes labeled with case numbers were stacked in long rows, and the one bearing the Halt case code showed no signs of being accessed since it was archived. Bishop requested that all the evidence be brought to the examination area, where each sealed bag was opened according to protocol to ensure all old data was reevaluated through the eyes of a modern investigator. The primary evidence, the shell casings, samples collected from the bedroom, items found near Clam Pass Park, had all been fully analyzed back in 2001. Though technology was now more advanced, Bishop realized those samples were unlikely to yield an immediate breakthrough. He continued examining the rest of the box, miscellaneous items collected because their value was undetermined, including papers, office supplies, tape reels, and personal devices seized from Holt's home. Among this group of evidence, a small palm-sized device began to catch his attention: an old mini cassette with a faded label that was almost illegible. The original report noted that the tape had been seized from a desk drawer to check for any messages or statements from Richard about leaving the house. The result at the time was assessed as poor audio quality, inaudible, unused. A tape that had been overlooked 20 years earlier now appeared as an anomaly in Bishop's eyes. If the cassette had been recorded around the time of Richard's disappearance, the possibility that it contained relevant content could not be ignored. He contacted the Miami-Dade Audio Analysis Lab, the unit capable of recovering low-quality signals, and requested that the entire tape be processed using modern equipment. The lab began restoring the heavily noisy audio track. Thick layers of interference made the voice on the tape blend into the background noise, but new signal separation technology was powerful enough to filter each frequency band. Through the processing, a woman's voice gradually became clear. Voice recognition software compared it to samples from old recordings in the case file, and the results showed the voice on the tape matched Marianne Holt, the victim's wife. Bishop spent time listening to the restored version. The content on the tape was not coherent, with the speaker's voice fluctuating in volume as if in a state of mental distress. However, the more carefully he listened, the more notable segments emerged. Marianne mentioned the name Tracy, not in the way one would refer to a casual acquaintance, but in a manner suggesting someone involved in something more complicated. Some fragmented sentences were noisy but clear enough for Bishop to note. The way Marianne said the name Tracy conveyed discomfort or confusion, as if referring to someone causing her anxiety. Though there were no direct statements mentioning Richard's death, the tape's content showed signs of a conversation revolving around coordination or disagreement between Marianne and the person named Tracy in the period close to the night the victim disappeared. The key point was this: Tracy Moran had only appeared once in the 2001 file as a family acquaintance, with no line suggesting any significant role. No one had evaluated her as a suspect, there was no direct linking evidence, and the file did not mention her again afterward. Yet now, an old tape previously deemed inaudible was placing that name at the center of a major question. Bishop understood that the tape could not be considered conclusive evidence, but it opened an entirely new investigative direction. The connection between Marianne Holt and Tracy Moran, something that had been undervalued or completely overlooked at the time of the case. This was the missing piece the case had lacked for 20 years, and if he wanted to move the Holt case forward, Bishop knew he had to find out who Tracy Moran really was, and why her name appeared in the only remaining recording of Marianne Holt. The clue from the tape led Detective Aaron Bishop to focus all his attention on the name Tracy Moran. In the old file, Moran was only mentioned as a family acquaintance of the Holts, with no other noteworthy information. However, the fact that Marianne's voice mentioned her in a highly stressed context suggested the relationship might be deeper than previously recorded. To determine that, Bishop began building Tracy Moran's personal profile from the most basic data. Bishop searched personal information, residency history and legal history for her. Public records showed Moran had lived in Naples for many years, working as a manager at a small bookstore not far from the Holt home. Regarding criminal history, Moran had no violent convictions, but Bishop discovered several noteworthy incidents. 2 admissions to mental health treatment facilities, a minor neighbor dispute recorded in 19. The gun-related incident immediately caught Bishop's interest. He requested the Court Archives Department to provide a copy of the report from that year. The case was not serious enough to result in criminal charges, but the evidence, a 20-gauge shotgun, had been confiscated under a public safety order. The gun was placed in the county's seized weapons storage and had never been claimed since. The manner of confiscation, the year of the incident, and the gun's storage location led Bishop to note a significant possibility. If Moran's shotgun was still in the evidence vault, it could be ballistically tested against the 20-gauge shell casing found in Richard's bedroom. This was an approach no one had taken in 2001 because they had never considered Moran a related suspect. Continuing to explore the relationship between Moran and the Holt family, Bishop reviewed statements from neighbors, friends and people in the area from 20 years earlier. Among the scant remaining information, he discovered Moran had attended a few small family events at the Holts, including at least one daughter's birthday party. Another witness recalled that she had been invited to the house by Marianne several times, indicating they were not just social acquaintances, but had a considerably close relationship. Bishop re-examined the 2001 search report of the Holt home and noticed a small detail that had been deemed insufficiently important at the time: a notebook listing Moran in the guest list for a family gathering. Back then, this detail was simply seen as sociable, but in the context of the cassette tape clue, the name appearing multiple times around the Holt family life led Bishop to question whether Moran played a larger role in Marianne's daily life. Another important step in building the profile was checking Moran's workplace. The small bookstore where she worked as manager had steady customers and was also a place where Moran could easily meet many people. Bishop noted Moran's 2001 work schedule to cross-reference with the new timeline. Among the data that emerged, there was no direct evidence showing Moran was unusually absent on the night of the incident, but neither was there anything proving she was elsewhere. When compiling all the information, Bishop realized Moran's profile contained many points making her a potential suspect: closeness to the Holt family, presence in their home, history of mental health issues, and especially prior ownership of a 20-gauge shotgun, the weapon type confirmed to have caused Richard Holt's death. All this data, though not enough to charge, was strong enough to place Moran at the center of the new investigative direction. Bishop knew his next step would determine whether the entire case could be reopened, testing the long-seized gun and comparing it to the shell casing found at the Holt crime scene. If the two matched, every dead end of the past 20 years would immediately swing open. The file on the 20-gauge shotgun seized years earlier made Detective Aaron Bishop realize he held a rare opportunity to verify what investigators in that gun, a franchise 20-gauge, had sat in seized weapons storage for a long time, untouched, never linked to Richard Holt's death. Now, with the discovery of the connection between Marianne Holt and Tracy Moran, Bishop determined that retesting the gun was the mandatory next step. Bishop contacted the Collier County Seized Weapons Management Department and requested the franchise be retrieved for transfer to the ballistics lab. The gun was still sealed, with accompanying records confirming it was confiscated in a civil matter in 2005, long after Richard's death. Though not directly related to the Holt case at the time of seizure, the gun's characteristics, type, gauge, and original owner made it the most worthwhile evidence to test. When the franchise arrived at the ballistics lab, technicians began the standard testing procedure: cleaning the barrel, checking mechanical condition, then firing the same type of 20-gauge ammunition into gel and trace recovery devices. Each fired round carried unique microscopic striations from the barrel, like a fingerprint unique to each gun. That was the scientific basis Bishop was counting on. While the technicians prepared the test fires, Bishop brought down the shell casing recovered from Richard's bedroom to the analysis room. The casing had been sealed since 2001, but still retained its metal structure and striations, sufficient for comparison with the test results. This had been impossible 20 years earlier because there was no gun to compare, and the county's ballistics matching system was very limited at the time. The test rounds were fired and recovered in a collection box, a device filled with special fibers to preserve both the casing and striations intact. Technicians separated the casings, placed them under a comparison microscope, rotating angles and adjusting magnification levels to find matching marks. Bishop stood behind, awaiting the results, knowing that even a substantial match would change everything. When the first comparison image appeared on the screen, the ballistics technician almost immediately paused. The circular striations along the base rim of the casing, the ones forming the barrel's unique fingerprint, matched perfectly with those on the casing found in Richard's bedroom. Not just partially, but to a degree that could not occur from two different guns. All mechanical features, firing pin impressions and threading on the rim were confirmed identical. An additional test was conducted for absolute certainty, firing another series of rounds, recovering them, and comparing again. The results were identical. 100% striation match, proving that the franchise 20-gauge seized in the 2005 incident was the gun that killed Richard Holt in his bedroom. Bishop requested a detailed ballistics report for the file. With this evidence, nearly all prior inferences about Tracy Moran were confirmed. The gun had belonged to Moran, and there was no record of it being stolen or transferred between two. This placed Moran as the only person with access to the gun during the time of the crime. Moreover, Bishop knew that a ballistics match this strong was not the kind of evidence easily dismissed. It did not rely on memory, witness statements, or anything that could change over time. It was physical evidence with near absolute accuracy, the kind every murder investigation needs. With the test results in hand, Bishop cross-referenced all the data, Mary Ann mentioning the name Tracy on the cassette tape, the close relationship between Moran and the Holt family, the staged bedroom cleanup, and forensic confirmation that Richard was shot at close range. All the pieces now connected into a complete logical chain. Tracy Moran was the person who directly fired the shot killing Richard Holt, and the case was no longer a mysterious disappearance, but a premeditated murder. However, identifying Moran as the shooter only solved half the picture. Bishop understood that someone like Moran, with the personality and circumstances described in the old file, was unlikely to have planned the entire crime systematically on her own. The gun had been revealed. The shooter had been identified. But who was behind it? Who directed it? And what reason made Moran involved in Richard's death? Those questions would need to be answered next, and Bishop knew that the moment to confront Tracy Moran was approaching fast. The ballistic examination results confirmed that Tracy Moran's franchise 20-gauge shotgun was indeed the weapon that caused Richard Holt's death. So the next step in the investigation process became clear. Bishop needed to directly confront Moran. A summons was signed, and Moran was brought into the interrogation room at the Collier County Sheriff's Office to formally work with the investigator after nearly 2 decades of the case lying dormant. From the very first minutes, Moran maintained a silent demeanor, avoiding direct eye contact with Bishop and responding as briefly as possible when asked to confirm personal information. When the questions shifted to matters related to the Holt family, she withdrew even further. Bishop noted that this attitude was not one of defiance, but rather a kind of wariness or fear, as if she was trying to evade more than resist. Bishop was in no hurry. He opened the case file, placed the crime scene photos on the table, and gave Moran time to realize that this interrogation was unlike any previous conversation. However, when he mentioned the 20-gauge shell casing found in Richard's bedroom, Moran simply looked down, offering no response. She neither denied nor confirmed it. All subsequent probing questions were met with silence. The situation changed when Bishop placed the latest ballistic report on the table, a comparison of the two shell casings, enlarged under a microscope, complete with the lab's certification mark. He clearly explained that the match was absolute and could not occur with two different guns. Moran could continue her silence, but the physical evidence could not remain silent on her behalf. At this point, Moran began to change her demeanor. Her facial expression wavered, her hands clasped together, and her eyes finally left the table to glance briefly at the ballistic match result. Bishop recognized this small shift, and gently continued, "No demand for a confession, no threats, just stating the fact that the evidence placed her at the scene holding the murder weapon. There was no longer any room for denial." Moran forced a strained smile, one difficult to distinguish between acceptance and despair, and leaned back in her chair. She did not respond immediately, but her silence was different now, the silence of someone weighing something greater than themselves. When Bishop asked the question once more, not focusing on guilt but on the reason, Moran finally sighed and began to speak. Her first words were halting, but gradually the story became coherent. Moran admitted that she was the one who fired the shot. She recounted that on the night Richard Holt was killed, she was inside the Holt home, using her own shotgun. However, Moran insisted from the outset that she did not come up with or initiate the act herself. According to Moran, it was Marianne Holt who created the psychological context that made her believe Richard was a major threat to Marianne. Moran described the complicated relationship between her and Marianne, personal conversations, sharing about the fear of Richard, and the feeling that Marianne saw Moran as the only one who could help her escape something terrible. Moran recounted how Marianne repeatedly suggested the possibility that Richard wouldn't live long, implying that everything would improve if he disappeared from her life. Bishop listened cautiously but asked Moran to provide specific detail. Moran explained that Marianne had shown her how to approach the Holt home through the side door, described exactly the bedroom where Richard was lying, and even guided the appropriate timing for the act, when the victim was weakened and she no longer feared detection. Moran said that Marianne had given her a simple sketch of the house, marking the path, the cabinet locations, the bed, the entrances and exits, and even where Marianne promised to make everything easier. When Bishop asked Moran about her actions after firing the shot, Moran confessed that she left the bedroom in extreme panic, no longer clearly remembering every detail. Certain things, like how the body was transported to Clam Pass Park, Moran did not directly confirm, but implied that she did not handle that part. According to her, Marianne had someone else to help move the body, or Marianne herself took care of the rest without clearly mentioning it to Moran. The most critical point in the statement was Moran's confirmation that Marianne Holt was the one who planned it, provided the motive, and chose the timing. Though Moran was the shooter, she insisted that she never thought she was murdering an innocent person, but was convinced she was helping Marianne escape Richard's control. A narrative that Bishop noted had never appeared in any statements from. With this confession, the entire case shifted to a new phase. The person who directly fired the shot had been identified, and now the name Marianne Holt emerged from the shadows of the original file, becoming the suspected mastermind in the death of her own husband. Tracy Moran's confession provided a clear enough framework of events for Detective Aaron Bishop to begin reconstructing the entire crime scene. The reconstruction was not solely based on Moran's description, but had to be verified against forensics and data collected. Every step needed to align with the traces the original investigation team had recorded, from the drag marks in the bedroom to the body's position at Clam Pass Park. Only when the two data sources, forensics and the confession, fully connected could Bishop have sufficient grounds to move the case to the conclusion phase. Bishop started from the origin point, Richard Holt's bedroom. Based on Moran's statement, he was lying on the bed when shot at close range. The 2001 forensics confirmed the wound from a 20-gauge shotgun to the abdominal area, fired from the foot of the bed with a slightly upward angle. The short blood spatter pattern with no widespread proved the victim was in a lying or semi-seated position, with no significant movement before being hit, perfectly matching Moran's claim that Richard had been lightly sedated with sleeping pills beforehand. Bishop recreated the bedroom layout to scale, marking the bed position, nightstand, side door direction, and the distance Moran described when standing to shoot. When placing the shooter's position in the model, the bullet trajectory matched exactly the direction determined by forensics 2 decades earlier. The shell casing's location jammed under the cabinet also made sense in the model, as it was the area right next to the recoil step after firing, consistent with the mild kick of a 20-gauge shotgun. After confirming the shooting position, Bishop moved to analyzing the drag marks. The faint smears on the wooden floor detected under specialized lighting in 2001 showed the body was dragged from the edge of the bed toward the room's side door, not toward the main entrance. Moran did not deny this, but she said she didn't remember who dragged the body. Nevertheless, forensics showed a clear drag direction, straight toward the side exit of the house. Bishop focused on this alignment rather than Moran's unclear statement. From the drag point, cleaning traces were found along the narrow hallway connecting the bedroom to the side door. The 2001 investigators had assumed these were just routine cleaning marks, but from a modern perspective, Bishop recognized they followed an extended drag path, exactly as Moran described the body being taken out through the side door rather than the front. This explained why neighbors heard or saw no suspicious activity. The side door was not in view of surrounding homes. Next, Bishop reconstructed the body transport from the Holt home to Clam Pass Park. The distance between the 2 points was short enough for a personal vehicle to move unnoticed at night. Moran did not describe the vehicle used in detail, but forensics at Clam Pass Park provided additional data. The body had no major scrapes or heavy abrasion marks, indicating it was not dragged over rough terrain or trails, but most likely transported by vehicle. When simulating the route, Bishop selected paths with low lighting, few homes, and minimal public cameras for 2001. These routes could easily have been used to reach Clam Pass without leaving traces. Based on the body's discovery position near mangrove roots, where water could rise slightly with tides, the model showed the body's placement there was consistent with being set down during rising or falling tide. Moran stated she did not clearly remember who handled the rest, and Bishop did not force this part of the confession to be overly precise behaviorally. More importantly, forensics at Clam Pass showed the body had no signs of impact from large hard objects or manual dragging over long distances. This reinforced the conclusion that the body was placed in the root area without struggle, consistent with death occurring at the home. Bishop pieced together each data fragment and built a complete 3D reconstruction. The shooting moment, victim position, Moran's stance, body drag path, exit through the side door, transport route, and endpoint at Clam Pass Park. The model showed every 2001 forensic detail, aligned with Moran's new confession, with no conflicting element. The case structure, once fragmented under the original investigators' efforts, now reassembled into a logical sequence. Richard shot at home, body dragged outside, loaded onto a vehicle, transported to Clam Pass, and placed in shallow water before discovery days later. When the reconstruction model was complete, Bishop knew it was not just technical groundwork for the next step, but a robust forensic match that could hold up in court. The case was clear, Tracy Moran was the shooter, but for it to happen, someone else had to orchestrate, prepare and that name, according to forensics, confession and investigative logic, was Marianne Holt. The complete crime scene reconstruction helped Detective Aaron Bishop see the full structure of the case, a chain of preparation, execution, and concealment extending from the Holt home to Clam Pass Park. However, to proceed to the final step requesting an arrest warrant, Bishop needed to compile all the evidence into a solid system strong enough to convince command, prosecutors and the judge. This required connecting every forensic piece, confession and supporting document, into a unified file, leaving no reasonable gaps that a defense attorney could exploit. Bishop started with the first layer of evidence, forensics collected and, though documented to the standards of that time, they retained strong legal and scientific value. Close-range gunshot wound showing Richard was murdered while unable to defend himself. Ammunition type 20 gauge, matching the shell found under the nightstand. Blood sleep aid levels, far exceeding therapeutic dose, proving Richard was weakened before death. cleaning traces and drag marks confirming the body was moved from the bedroom to the side door. Each forensic element stood independently, but together they painted a consistent picture. Richard Holt was killed at home, then the body moved to stage a disappearance. The next step in the compiled file was ballistic evidence. Not just part of the case, this was the decisive spearhead Bishop knew the court could not dismiss. The franchise .20 gauge, seized in a 2005 civil matter, was identified as the gun previously owned by Tracy Moran. Ballistic comparison showed the scene shell and test-fired shell from Moran's gun matched perfectly on all microscopic features, from firing pin marks to barrel scratches. This was physical evidence with near absolute accuracy, irreproducible, unalterable, independent of memory. Strongest point, forensics and ballistics supported each other without contradiction despite 2 decades apart. Bishop moved to the mini cassette tape, evidence overlooked for 20. After restoration by the Miami-Dade Audio Lab, the tape emerged as the critical third piece. The speaking voice identified as Marianne Holt. Marianne mentioned the name Tracy in a mentally unstable state, with a tone of caution and urging. Fragmented phrases like "don't say anything," "that night," "do it right," "don't let it show," created clear signals of a plan's existence. Though not direct incriminating proof, the audio tape served as corroborating evidence, proving Marianne and Tracy Moran had a more complex connection than initial statements suggested multiple times. This was crucial foundation for understanding motive and mastermind role. The most important part of the compiled file came from Tracy Moran's interrogation. Moran admitted she fired the shot. Moran asserted Marianne Holt instigated, planned and directed the entire process. Moran described in detail the Holt home layout, bedroom approach, timing when Richard was weakened by drugs. Moran said Marianne continually emphasized Richard's danger to psychologically manipulate her. Key point: Moran's confession perfectly matched the drag marks, shooting position, trajectory and time of death recorded by forensics. No significant contradictions between the account and forensic result. This created mutual reinforcement. Forensics proved Moran's story wasn't fabricated, and Moran explained forensic details unanswered in 2001. Bishop summarized: Richard drugged, shot dead in bedroom, dragged to side door, body loaded onto vehicle, transported, placed in shallow water at Clam Pass. Clam Pass not death site, only disposal site. Murder weapon, Moran shot per Marianne's instructions. Tape shows urging, Moran names Marianne as mastermind. The chain was seamless, uninterrupted. After presenting the full file to the prosecutor, Bishop emphasized 3 factors: tight evidence structure, not reliant on one individual; forensics, ballistics, audio, confession, all mutually reinforcing; clear motive. Marianne wanted Richard eliminated for financial gain and life control. With this compilation, the prosecutor agreed. Sufficient grounds to seek a warrant for Marianne Holt on charges of masterminding first-degree murder. The Holt case, cold for 20 years, had finally reached its most pivotal turning point. The compiled case file was strong enough to present to the judge, making the process of obtaining an arrest warrant for Marianne Holt proceed smooth. The Collier County prosecutor submitted the full forensic evidence, ballistics results, the recovered audio tape, and the complete testimony of Tracy Moran. Each piece was analyzed as an independent puzzle part, yet they complemented each other perfectly, forming a system of evidence that was nearly irrefutable. The judge reviewed it for nearly 2 hours, and finally signed the arrest warrant for Marianne on charges of masterminding first-degree murder. The warrant was transferred back to the office that same afternoon. Detective Bishop, who had pursued the case from the very first steps of reopening the file, was assigned to lead the task force executing the arrest. Within the cold case unit, the atmosphere was tense but filled with determination. No one could hide the feeling that they were about to close one of Collier County's longest pending cases, one that had once seemed like it would never be solved. Marianne Holt's current residence was in a quiet neighborhood in East Naples, where she had lived quietly for many years under the image of a woman who had endured family tragedy. The task force moved in 2 unmarked vehicles to avoid drawing attention. Bishop did not want to create any scene that would attract neighbors' scrutiny before the warrant was executed. As the team approached the house, Bishop directed one group to cover the rear for safety, while he and 2 other officers advanced to the front door. They knocked, without rushing, maintaining a serious demeanor to avoid creating pressure that could lead to an unexpected reaction. Marianne opened the door after a few seconds. She appeared confused upon seeing a group of people at her doorstep, and when Bishop identified himself, she simply nodded slightly, saying nothing. The moment Bishop announced the arrest warrant for masterminding the death of Richard Holt, Marianne's expression changed only for a split second. No screaming, no denial, no anger. Instead, a blank face, like someone who had long known this moment would come sooner or later. She extended her hands forward when cuffed, without resistance. During the escort to the vehicle, most neighbors still hadn't noticed what was happening. The arrest was carried out cleanly, silently, and by the book, completely contrasting with the severity of the charges Marianne faced. Bishop noted that she didn't ask a single question, didn't request to contact a lawyer immediately, nor did she demand further explanation of the evidence. That composure in the eyes of an experienced investigator was not a sign of innocence, but rather the mark of someone who had lived too long with a secret and had grown exhausted from concealing it. As Marianne was taken out of the neighborhood and transported to headquarters, the Sheriff's Office Public Information Department prepared to release details of the arrest. A press conference was held shortly afterward, attended by representatives from the Cold Case Unit, the district prosecutor, and the forensics team that had assisted in the reinvestigation. The public and media had largely forgotten about Richard Holt's 2001 disappearance, so the news of his wife's arrest after nearly 20 years immediately caused a major stir. At the press conference, the spokesperson announced that solving the case was a major turning point for the Cold Case Unit and a prime example of how modern forensic technology could unlock mysteries that seemed buried forever. When asked about what led to the breakthrough, the unit representative affirmed, "No evidence is too old if it's preserved properly, and no case is truly closed until the truth is found." With Marianne Holt's arrest, the Richard Holt case officially entered a new phase, the phase where the truth would finally be brought to light in court. The arrest of Marianne Holt ended 2 decades of deadlock, but the most important part of the case truly began when the trial was scheduled for early 20. The Collier County prosecutor prepared a case file of rare scale for such a long cold case. All forensic evidence, ballistics, recovered audio, crime scene reconstructions, and Tracy Moran's full testimony were organized into a logical, airtight outline. This was the result of months of coordination between the Cold Case Unit, the Florida State Lab, and the prosecutor's office. On the opening day of the trial, the courtroom was nearly packed. Those who had followed the case in 2001 or heard about it wanted to witness how a file that seemed forgotten had become the center of public attention. Marianne entered the courtroom with her familiar calm demeanor, but her eyes no longer avoided contact as they had on the day of her arrest. For many present, this was the moment that showed time does not make guilt disappear, but only makes it heavier. Right in the opening statement, the prosecution went straight to the core. Richard Holt did not die in an accident, nor disappear voluntarily, but was the victim of an intentional act, carried out with a clear plan and collusion between Marianne Holt and Tracy Moran. Unlike cases relying heavily on witness testimony, this one carried special weight due to the large amount of preserved forensic and physical evidence over 2 decades. The prosecutor presented the autopsy report, a close-range gunshot wound to the abdomen, high levels of sleeping pills in Richard's blood, cleaning traces in the bedroom, and drag marks leading to the side door. Photos from the 2001 crime scene were enlarged on the projector screen. The prosecutor emphasized that every trace pointed to one thing: Richard was killed at home, in a state where he could not resist. When the ballistics comparison chart appeared, between the casing recovered at the scene and test-fired casings from Tracy Moran's franchise .20 gauge, the courtroom fell almost completely silent. The ballistics expert explained the microscopic structure of the rifling marks in the barrel, a kind of fingerprint that cannot be duplicated. The expert's conclusion: no 2 guns in the world produce the same marks. This gun is the one that shot Richard Holt. The defense did not deeply contest this point because the forensics were too clear. Instead, they tried to shift focus to Moran's psychological state to reduce Marianne's responsibility. The cassette tape forgotten for 20 years was seen by the prosecution as the catalyst for reopening the case. The recovered portion played in court was not long, but enough for listeners to clearly sense the disturbance in Mary Ann's voice. When the phrase "Tracy has to do it right" rang out, many jury members showed clear attention. The prosecutor emphasized, "The tape does not directly describe the murder, but it proves Mary Ann and Moran had secret exchanges related to an act that needed to be concealed." Mary Ann tried to control information and guide Moran's actions. This establishes the psychological foundation, leading to the conclusion that Mary Ann was the directing force. The most pivotal part of the trial was Moran's testimony before the jury. After much hesitation, she took the stand with the mindset of someone who had accepted responsibility but also wanted the truth revealed. Moran affirmed she was the one who pulled the trigger on the franchise. She did it under influence and psychological pressure from Mary Ann. Mary Ann constantly portrayed Richard as a threat. Mary Ann provided diagrams, directions to the bedroom, and chose the timing. Mary Ann promised to handle the rest. In the moment, Moran described Mary Ann saying, "If he just disappears, everything will be fine." Many in the courtroom turned to look at Mary Ann. She showed no reaction, just staring straight ahead. The defense tried to counter that Moran was testifying to lighten her own sentence, that her statements were subjective and lacked evidence, proving Mary Ann directly assigned the murder. However, the prosecution countered by consistently cross-referencing Moran's words with the forensics, and every point matched perfectly. There was no trace in the Holt house that contradicted Moran's testimony. This made the defense's efforts appear weak. After nearly 2 weeks of trial, the jury was sent to deliberate. Deliberation lasted less than a day, a sign of how convincing the prosecution's case was. When they returned to the courtroom, the foreperson was asked to announce the verdict. In the tense silence, the decision rang out. "We find the defendant Mary Ann Holt guilty of first-degree murder as the mastermind." No shouting, no objections. Mary Ann just closed her eyes briefly. The sentence was pronounced: life imprisonment without parole. With this verdict, the Richard Holt case was officially closed after 22 years. And for the cold case unit, this was not just a legal victory, but also proof of the value of persistence, modern forensic technology, and the belief that no truth can be buried forever. The verdict against Mary Ann Holt quickly spread beyond the courtroom and created widespread reactions throughout the Naples community. For many residents in the area, the news that the widow, once seen as a symbol of endurance and loss, was actually the one behind her husband's death nearly 2 decades earlier, caused profound shock. Those who had sympathized with Mary Ann when Richard disappeared, who had sent condolences or offered emotional support, now had to face a completely different truth. The image of the grieving wife was merely a facade concealing a long-running conspiracy. The neighborhood where the Holt family had lived became a major topic of discussion. Many neighbors shared with the media that they could never have imagined Mary Ann could be involved in Richard's death. Conversations in coffee shops, supermarkets, and community centers suddenly turned back time, recalling the early days of the 2001 search. The flashlight beams sweeping through mangrove forests, volunteer groups searching along the Gordon River, and the tears Mary Ann had shed in front of the media. Now all those memories felt heavy with a sense of betrayal. Many old acquaintances of the Holt family, K-workers, business associates, and members of groups Mary Ann had joined, were equally shaken. Some remembered Mary Ann appearing at fundraisers, looking exhausted, saying she couldn't sleep after her husband's death. Others recalled her complaints about the hardships following the loss. When the truth emerged that she was the mastermind behind that tragedy, the common emotion in the community was not just surprise, but confusion about their own judgment. Media interest surged immediately after the trial. Local TV stations and Florida state newspapers began redoing reports on the case, revisiting Richard's disappearance, the prolonged search, the 20-year dead ends, and finally the breakthrough thanks to modern forensic technology. Many reports emphasized that the Holt case was a prime example of how a cold case could come back to life, not just through forensic science, but also through investigators willing to reapproach old files with fresh perspective. Some national documentary programs also contacted the cold case unit for interviews about solving the case. They focused on the elements that made the Holt story compelling: the family nature, hidden motives, sophisticated staging, and long pendants. The case was quickly compared to other famous Florida files, and many journalists called it one of the strongest cold case revivals of the decade. However, the greatest impact of the case was not on TV or in newspapers, but in the psychology of the Naples community. Many began to reconsider the view that old cases without clear suspects could be forgotten forever. The Halt case showed that sometimes those old boxes in storage archives hold the answers to long-standing mysteries, and that new technology could unlock what was once thought impossible. Community trust in the investigative forces also increased significantly. The cold case unit solving a nearly 22-year-old case gave hope to many other families with pending files. Quite a few people began contacting police to ask if their loved one's case could be reviewed again. The Halt case ultimately became a symbol of persistence and progress in criminal investigation, while also serving as a powerful reminder that behind seemingly ordinary family events could lie truths no one anticipated. And for the Naples community, this story forever changed how they viewed justice, truth, and cases that seemed buried by time. In the context of today's United States, the story of the Richard Halt case in Naples, Florida, is not just a thrilling Florida 2001 cold case solved, but also touches on many issues very close to modern life: domestic violence, psychological manipulation, community trust, and the role of technology in protecting justice. The fact that Marianne Halt, a widow neighbors saw as a wife who endured great loss, turned out to be the mastermind behind her husband's death, shows that a gentle, polite exterior is never the sole measure to judge a person. In a society that values privacy like America, neighbors often hesitate to interfere in others' private lives, but sometimes unusual signs, like someone constantly bad-mouthing or belittling their spouse, controlling finances, or exploiting others' trust, as Marianne manipulated Tracy Moran, are important indicators that need attention and reporting if there's a safety risk. The cold case unit's persistence in reopening the file, using modern forensic matching ballistics from the Franchi 20 gauge to the casing in Richard's bedroom, and recovering the cassette tape with Marianne's voice, shows the value of professional evidence preservation and trusting the legal system even if justice arrives late. The real-life lesson for people living in the United States today is respect your intuition about toxic relationships. Don't downplay emotional abuse in the family. Reach out to police, hotlines, or support organizations if something feels off. At the same time, believe that speaking up, cooperating with investigations, and preserving evidence, even a small detail, can be the piece that solves a case, bringing justice to victims, even if it takes 20 years, like the Halt family. Thank you for following to the end of the story, where justice after 20 years has finally been illuminated. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other dramatic cold cases, and see you in the next video.